Well, it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Mark Vogelsberger for our seminar today, our Friday seminar. Mark got his PhD in Munich at the Max Planck Institute and also from the university under the supervision of Professor Dr. Simon White. And he actually won the Rudolf Kippenhahn Prize for his thesis. He then moved to the US. He was a postdoctoral fellow at the Harvard Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics and also a Hubble Fellow. And then he joined the ranks of MIT faculty in 2014. As an assistant professor, he won a Sloan Research Fellowship and was promoted to associate professor in 2018. And it's our pleasure to have him here today, if only virtually, to tell us more about a galaxy and structure formation in the young universe.
Okay. Yeah, thanks a lot, Robert, for the very kind introduction. And yeah, I hope I can visit in person soonish. So it's still a bit difficult this time. Yeah, thanks a lot for giving me the chance to talk to you. And actually, I should say, you know, the work I'm going to talk about, you're probably in the grander theme of things very familiar with. I mean, Robert and many others of you do really great work in that field. So just try to add a bit on that to tell you what we did over the last couple of years. So before I get started with the actual research, let me just show you well what we all kind of know about the the evolution of the universe, starting from the very early times with Big Bang, then the CMB, all the way to the nonlinear regime. And the challenge is really this nonlinear regime, which is why we need simulations. So we can do very little with pen and paper or analytic work in this very nonlinear regime where you get large density contrasts. And so this is why we have to resort to simulations. And of course now there's this enormous space of simulation. So over the last 10-15 years we have really seen kind of an explosion of all kinds of simulations. So this is a figure that tries to summarize that a bit, showing zoom versus large volume simulations, but then also contrasting dark matter only and hydrodynamical simulations. And this is not complete. What I show here just shows a couple of projects to give you an idea. And so there's really been very impressive work over the last couple of years by a lot of groups. And so this really became a kind of an industry, these simulations. Now, we also contributed a bit to that. So we had this Illustris and Illustris TNG projects. So Illustris TNG is the latest one. This is fully publicly available since 2021. So this is when we added TNG 50 to the public pool. So Illustris TNG consists of 3 simulations, TNG 50, 100, and 300, where the number always indicates kind of the side length of the box. And so depending on what science you're interested in, whether it's clusters or L-star or sub-L-star galaxies, you can pick your favorite box. I should mention that the galaxy formation model in Illustris TNG, has been developed for many, many years. So we started working on that about a decade ago, which then led to this Illustris galaxy formation model. And you see a lot of people have worked on that. And there were then a lot of spin-offs like the Illustris TNG that I just mentioned, but also the Auriga project, which are these zoom-in Milky Way simulations, and the Fable project, which is a project led at IOA Cambridge. And currently there's another project underway, which is led by Volker Springel in Munich, the Millennium TNG project, which is a combination of the original Millennium volume with the TNG galaxy formation project. And so but the point I want to make is that a lot of people have been involved, and it took really a long time to get this all going. Now let me show you just 1 or 2 results of Illustris TNG. So this is a plot from Volker Springel's paper, just to demonstrate, that we get kind of a reasonable galaxy population. So this is a low redshift result comparing the projected 2-point correlation function of the simulation, shown by the red line, with SDSS data. And the takeaway is that we get pretty good agreement. It's not perfect yet, but it's quite impressive, given the spatial scales and also the mass range that's covered here, how well this is actually working now. Similarly, you can also extend this to higher redshifts. So here I show UV luminosity functions, again comparing TNG results to various observational points, showing this from redshift 2 to redshift 10. And again, the main takeaway is that it's probably not perfect agreement, but it's nevertheless quite impressive. Again, the dynamic range and the redshift range that we cover and the level of agreement we get here. Now, let me move on to this new project. So a lot of the simulations I showed you before on this overview slide were actually mostly focused on galaxy formation in the low redshift or lower redshift universe. And some were specifically concerned with galaxy properties at redshift 0 and then tracing them back in time. But it was most of them were just lower redshift explorations. However, as you know, there's now a lot of push observationally towards the high redshift universe with JWST and various 21 centimeter probes. And so we thought about this, and we want to work a bit on this front and make some predictions also for the high redshift universe. And this is actually what this THESAN project is about. So the idea is really that we would like to model the epoch of reionization. Now, modeling reionization is a bit difficult because you essentially have to trace the photon production, then the transmission of the photons through the ISM, through the CGM, and then through how they affect actually the IGM. So it's a large dynamic range and a lot of physics is involved. Now, historically, you can do this in two different ways. You can do this either in post-processing. So you take a hydrodynamical simulation and you do, you can even do it with a dark matter simulation and just do some RT in post-processing on some grid. That is, of course, very efficient if you want to explore the parameter space, but you have to do a couple of approximations, like you have to approximate source functions, escape fractions, gas self-shielding, and so on and so forth. The other approach is that you do full RHD simulations. Those are, of course, in some sense more predictive because they're more self-consistent, but they are also computationally more expensive. And so there also have been a lot of interesting projects over the last couple of years, like the CODA simulations, for example, that really did very impressive work in modeling this reionization or process and the epoch of reionization through these RHD simulations. And so this is also what we do in THESAN. So we also aim for this, or we try to do this RHD approach. And if I say we, I mostly mean three postdocs, namely Raoul Kanan, who was a postdoc at MIT, who's now a postdoc at CFA, then Aaron Smith, who's a postdoc at MIT, and Enrico Garaldi, who's a postdoc with Volker Springel at MPA. And the idea is really to do these RHD simulation on a reasonably large volume with pretty good numerical resolution. Now, to do this, we combine in THESAN three things. We take the galaxy formation model from Elastos TNG, which has been tested quite a bit at various epochs and for various observables. And we in general find that it provides a very good description of the galaxy population and the properties of the galaxies. So this is combined with a new radiative transfer code that Raoul has implemented in Arepo. So this is Arepo RT. So this is a moment-based method, second order accurate, where we track here three frequency bins. And you can see the expansion of the H2 region here on the left, just as a little test problem. So this is combined to the TNG model. And then on top of that, we also implement we have a new, or actually two dust models in the code that allow you to track the evolution of cosmic dust. So there's a scalar dust model where the dust is just a property of the hydrocells. And then there's a live dust model where you really have a separate particle distribution or particle species of the dust, where you can also track the grain size distribution. So what you see on the right, these right upper left, these equations, these are the equations governing the growth and the destruction of the dust for the scalar dust model. And on the left in the schematic figure, this is showing you essentially showing you the processes that are implemented in the live dust model. So there are dust gas interactions implemented. also dust, like coagulation and shattering that change the grain size distribution, and then of course also dust production and the interaction with supernova shocks. So in THESAN, we use the scalar dust and not the live dust. Yeah, so this has mostly the reason that we have more experience with the scalar dust. So the live dust is a more recent development, and so we use this more solid and better understood and tested scalar dust model. So these three things are combined together: TNG, AREPO-RT, and the dust. And just to show you that these things are also working. So here's, for example, a test plot that we made a couple of years ago for the dust properties of galaxies and comparing to some scaling relations. So in colors, these are a couple of simulations of galaxies, and then you see here two dust scaling relations with some observational data. And the main point is that the dust content predicted by the model is not it's not crazy. It's kind of in line with what we expect from many scaling relations, and you can check this with other things as well. So in general, this model is behaving pretty well in terms of agreement with observational data. Okay, so we combine all these three things, and then we ran this THESAN simulation. So THESAN consists of one flagship run, which has a volume of close to 100 megaparsec cube. The particle number is about twice as large as what we have in TNG 100, so it's 2 times 2100 cube, and the particle mass for dark matter and the gas cell mass are about a factor of 2 smaller than what we have in TNG. So we have twice as good mass resolution as TNG 100, and yeah, then you also see the softening length and the smallest cell size. Now on the left you see kind of some visualization of the simulation output. Various things, like on the left the photon density here, the gas density, gas temperature, the metal distribution in the gas, the dust content, and then the H1 fraction. And then the inset, you see some mock JWST and ALMA images. And the main point that we wanted to achieve with THESAN is combining essentially RT and modeling the epoch of reionization with a simulation where we can at the same time resolve the galaxies very well. Yeah, so the smallest cell size is about 10 parsec, so we can really resolve the internal structures of the galaxies pretty well, and this is kind of highlighted here in this image by these zoom in view here. Now THESAN does not only consist of this flagship run, but there are also a couple of other runs. There's, for example, THESAN 2, which is an 8 times lower resolution version, and then there are some modifications of the escape fraction in the run. So there's a THESAN high and low. So this is just a different parameterization of the escape fraction, where in high you have a high escape fraction for high mass systems, and in low you have a high escape fraction for low mass systems. And then there's also this SDEO run. I will say a bit more about this in a second. So this is essentially an alternative dark matter model. And then there are some other control runs, like runs with the original TNG model or dark matter only simulations. So to put this a bit into context, where things stand in terms of resolution and volume, and compare this to other simulations. So a couple of years ago, Dylan Nelson made this plot here on the right for hydrodynamical simulations, comparing all kind of hydrodynamical simulations in this space of baryon mass resolution versus number of resolved galaxies. And the desired direction here is to go to the upper right, essentially, in that plot. And so Raoul made a similar plot for reionization or epoch of reionization simulations over the last couple of years, like with CODA 2, CODA 3, and so on and so forth. And again, showing you the minimum cell size and the large volume, and ideally you want to go in this plot towards the lower right corner. Yeah, and so this, of course, this space is not as densely populated as the hydro simulation plot here. But I expect that in the near future we will see many more of these RT simulations, especially, as I said, with all the new observations coming online. Now I mentioned that there's also this dark matter only, this alternative dark matter model. I do not want to talk too much about that, but this is I just say it because that might sound a bit exotic to some of you, this SDAO model. So this is a model where you have the dark matter particle coupled to a very light particle in the early universe. And so you get, similar to baryonic acoustic oscillations, you get these dark acoustic oscillations that you can see here in the power spectrum. And you get a damping, but the damping looks rather different from what you are used to from warm dark matter, where you do not see these oscillations. So it's a bit of another dark matter model that we wanted to explore in this simulation. Good. Let me show you some results. So first, here are some light cones from redshift 16 to 5.5. So this is not yet too exciting. It's simply dark matter density and gas density. What's more interesting is then if you move on to the H2 fraction and the gas temperature, you nicely see this patchy reionization here. And then what we really tried to get right is the sources of the radiation. So we wanted to get the galaxy population right. And so I just have a couple of plots to make that point. So we start here with the stellar to halo mass relation, comparing to the Baruzzi 2019 data. So the black line, solid line, is what the simulation predicts, and this blue part here is what the Baruzzi data says. And then there are also a couple of other data points from other simulations on that plane. And generally speaking, I think we, again, not a perfect agreement, but we are pretty happy with the stellar masses we get. Of course, this is more or less directly inherited from the TNG model. So the TNG model has, of course, been calibrated in various ways, and so the agreement is not too surprising in that relation here. Similarly, you can check the galaxy stellar mass function. Here there's a bit of we undershoot a bit the high mass abundance here. It's not too bad. It's still within the error bars, but there's clearly a bit of a trend that we are biased towards lower number counts here, or number densities. But also here we are, if you look at redshift 6, for example, we are kind of, and also redshift 7, pretty happy with the result. And of course, getting these things right is important to get the whole reionization process right, because these are literally the sources of your photons. You can then also check things inside of the galaxies and around the galaxies in terms of the metallicity and the dust. So on the left is this mass metallicity relation of the gas. You see that there's very little redshift evolution. So this is something that we found already in TNG. Also going towards lower redshifts. Now, the observations are, of course, very uncertain here, but it's kind of consistent, or the simulation data is kind of consistent with the observation data. On the right, there is this is a plot showing you the mass density of metals and dust in the full box, and then distinguish between ISM, CGM, and the IGM. And you actually see this significant, what's already known, but the significant contribution of metals and also of the dust to the CGM here. Of course, the dust normalization is way lower than the gas phase metals, but nevertheless, it's quite significant what you get in the CGM here. And then the last thing about the stellar population is that I want to show is the UV luminosity function on the left. Also here, this is just a sanity check that we get the UV luminosities right. This is showing them from redshift 6 to 10, comparing to observations. Here we also showed the THESAN 2 result with these dashed lines. So you see this turnover, that's numerical resolution. But then if you compare this to THESAN SDAO2, which has the matched numerical resolution to THESAN 2, you see this additional suppression. So this is because of this damping in this alternative dark matter model in the power spectrum. So that behaves similar to warm dark matter, but again, it has these additional oscillations in the power spectrum. Then on the right is the star formation rate density. Also over the range where we have observational data, this is consistent. Now, if you break this down in stellar mass, you also see these bending behavior and these dips towards lower redshift. So we haven't looked at that in great detail, but it's probably related to photo heating feedback that we get here for the smaller systems. But again, this is still with some caveats because we haven't yet checked that in detail. Okay, so then let's move on more to the new part, to the photons and to the whole reionization process. So the first thing I would like to show is this plot, which is a bit busy, but the main point is if you focus on the red line and the solid red line and the dashed red line, which is hidden below these other dashed lines here on the bottom, this is actually showing you the contribution of the photons from the stars and the AGN. So in the volume we have for the model, we have the AGN over that redshift range are really subdominant, and essentially all the hydrogen reionization is driven here by the stars. In the model, you see this is a significantly larger number. This is nearly 2 orders of magnitude. So you just have a percent level contribution from the AGN here. Now you can then check how the neutral hydrogen fraction evolves with redshift, which is kind of the standard plot to make to see how reionization proceeds in the simulation. And again, this is shown here for all different models. The red line is the flagship run. Now the first takeaway is that given the limited data we have, or the upper limits and lower limits that we have, it's kind of consistent. There's one thing which is a bit surprising, that if you look at the red line here, it doesn't go down all the way to, say, 10 to the minus 4. So it stops at 10 to the minus 3. So the reason for that is that at the time where the simulation stops, which is redshift 5.5, there's still a tiny patch of the volume left that's not yet fully reionized. So if you look at the blue line, which is the level 2 resolution, which was run to slightly later redshifts to 5.2, so then you can see that this goes all the way down. Yeah, so we have this rather late reionization in the simulation, and also pretty extended reionization history. Now there's one outlier in this plot on the left, which is the green line. So this is this THESAN low model where the reionization is mostly driven through the parameterization of the escape fractions, mostly driven by low mass systems. And then you get this very, very early reionization. So essentially reionization here is already complete at redshift 6.3. And if you then look at the optical depth on the right, you realize that that leads then also to inconsistencies with Planck constraints. So this model is kind of, it's kind of ruled out, right? So because of this very, very early reionization. The other model that we have, the THESAN high, where you have where the escape fractions are larger for high mass systems, that's kind of the opposite trend. So there you go a bit later, and then you can also see that this is reflected in the optical depth. So THESAN low and THESAN high, they kind of bracket bracket the range of interesting escape fraction parameterizations. Okay, so now I mentioned before that we tried to get this reasonably high resolution in the runs. And so the nice thing with the resolution is that you can then look not only at these globally average properties of reionization, but you can really zoom in onto individual halos or galaxies to check the local reionization history around these objects. And so this is shown here for 3 different halos. The halo masses here are quoted at redshift 5.5. And then you can see redshifts 9, 8, 7, and 6, how the H1 fraction just changes. And so you see in the early stages that the iPhones are still moving rather slowly, and then they speed up in low density gas. And then eventually at redshift 6, most of the gas here in the volume is then reionized, except for the nodes and filaments, right, where you still have this high density gas. So you have these neutral filaments and neutral gas in the galaxies. That is not ionized. Another way to quantify this a bit more in detail is if you look at the ionization histories at different gas densities. And here you see this typical inside-out reionization. So you see, for example, that the midpoint of reionization varies from redshift 8.2 for high-density regions to 7 for low-density regions. So these vertical lines here represent the midpoints. So that's this typical picture that the radiation just goes in this inside-out fashion to reionize the gas in the volume here. This is also something that you can see more visually if you make a reionization redshift plot, which you can see here. So here, each pixel shows the reionization redshift, meaning that's the minimum redshift with hydrogen ionization fraction greater or equal 0.99. And again, you see this inside-out reionization where the largest structures reionize first, redshifts greater than 10. So these are the bluish regions. And then much later, you follow with low density regions that are here shown yellow and red. But then still buried in these bluish regions, you see the filaments and the nodes. Yeah? So still you see this, as in one of the previous plots, you see this neutral regions. Now, the nice thing is you can then again contrast the two parameterizations of the escape fractions. So here this THESAN low on the left and THESAN high on the right. So where you get this very early reionization for the low model, where again the low mass systems dominate, and then the later reionization in THESAN high, where the high mass systems dominate, kind of consistent with what I showed you before in the neutral hydrogen fraction. Okay, now one thing is, of course, that in reionization you get these bubbles, and of course you would like to somehow measure these bubbles, and this is also what 21 centimeter will do to map out these bubbles. And so a simple way to do a first measurement is to look at power spectra of ionized hydrogen here. So this is shown in this plot for different H2 fractions that are then mapped also to redshifts, as you can see in the color bar. So what you can see here is that H2 regions that formed early on in the initial phases, those are quite small. Yeah, so you have this whole power spectrum shifted towards more to the right. And then as reionization progresses, the ionized regions begin to become larger as a consequence of galaxies becoming larger and star formation rates increasing, and that's nicely reflected in this evolution of the power spectrum here. You can also do this a bit more visually. So these are bubble size distributions in the THESAN and THESAN high runs at ionization fraction of 0.3. Yeah, so the white lines always denote the borders of the perimeter of the bubbles. Now, if you go to another ionization fraction from 0.3 to 0.7, you can nicely see how these bubbles essentially evolve. And so what's of course interesting about the bubbles is that the size and the distribution of these bubbles depend on a lot of interesting things like astrophysics and cosmology, like for example the star formation rate, the escape fractions, the gas distribution, but then also things like the dark matter model. So for example, we have a student now who's currently looking into the differences between the bubble size distribution in these SDO models versus the fiducial THESAN model. And so there's a lot of interesting information that is encoded in this bubble size distribution. Another way to look at that is I showed you only in the power spectrum before only one model. Now you can look at the different models also here at 3 different H1 fractions, 0.7, 0.5, and then on the right 0.3. And you see that THESAN, the fiducial one, for example, shows a wide range of bubble sizes in the range of 0.3 to 6 H over co-moving megaparsec. But then the SDO model has larger bubbles, which kind of makes sense intuitively because you have this cutoff of the small scales in this model. And the same is true for the differences between THESAN low and THESAN high. So THESAN low has more smaller bubbles because you have the escape fractions set to low mass systems, and then THESAN high has larger bubbles because it's more tailored, but the escape fractions are more tailored towards high mass systems. So as I said, we will try to look at this a bit more in detail, where we also then try to really quantify the volumes of the bubbles and make really volume statistics and not only power spectra. But I think this is really something quite interesting to differentiate different models and potentially also different dark matter models. Good. Let me also, for the next maybe 15 or 20 minutes, say a bit of what we want to do next with THESAN. So there are a couple of directions we would like to go. One direction is that we are thinking about running a larger volume. So especially for 21 centimeter, we will need a larger volume going beyond this 100 megaparsec cube, which is way too small essentially for that. So that's one direction. And another direction is that we want to go towards smaller scales. And that is what I want to discuss now. So you have seen, or maybe implicitly seen, that we have to assume certain escape fractions. So these are not self-consistently calculated, the escape fractions. And one reason for that is that A, we don't have sufficient resolution in the galaxies to do this properly. And second, we have a still rather simplistic ISM model that we have used in THESAN. And so I want to spend a couple of minutes now talking about how we want to overcome these problems over the next couple of months. And so the key, or one of the key ideas, is that we have to use a new ISM model. So in THESAN, we use still the same ISM model as in Illustris TNG, which is the same one as in Illustris and as in Auriga and many other simulations, which is kind of an effective equation of state model where you do not resolve the multi-phase structure of the gas. Now, this then means that you cannot, resolve H2 regions properly, and especially you cannot model in great detail the photon propagation through the gas, and then as a consequence, of course, you cannot make any definite predictions on escape fractions. So we really need a new ISM model, and of course there are now a lot of different ISM models that have been developed over the last 5 to 10 years, like for example FIRE and others. So here we developed something similar also a couple of years ago for Arepo, and again, if I say we, I mostly mean Federico Marinacci and Laura Sales, who have developed this Smuggle ISM model, which is fully implemented in Arepo, and this was published already in 2019. And the idea of this model is very, very similar to FIRE. So it shares a lot of similarities with FIRE and some of the other recent explicit ISM models. So it's an explicit modeling of the stellar feedback in terms of OB and AGB winds, also the modeling of supernova, but also radiative feedback from young stars in terms of photoionization and radiation pressure. And it also has extended gas cooling. So not only the metal-line cooling and the primordial cooling that we have in TNG, but also more detailed predictions or parameterizations for self-shielding, low temperature cooling, and so on and so forth. So if you use that model and run a galaxy or simulate a galaxy and compare it with the same galaxy in the TNG model, you get this plot here. So this is just showing the gas density, surface density. On the left, the TNG model, on the right, the Smuggle model. And just visually, you immediately see that there's a lot more structure in this Smuggle model. So even without plotting a density PDF, you would guess that this is kind of on the right here, a broader and PDF with more features than what you would see on the left here in this more smooth density distribution. And these differences become even larger if you look at the gas at the phase diagram of the gas. So plotting number density versus temperature. Now on the left is what's called here typical effective ISM model. So that is literally the TNG model. TNG is not the only simulation that uses a lot of these large volume simulations, like Eagle and many others use that. And there's of course a reason why these simulations use it, because for the resolution you can achieve in these large volume simulations, at least historically, it was not really possible to resolve the ISM in great detail if you have a 102 or 300 megaparsec cube volume. So then it was always assumed that the ISM is sub-resolution in these models. And so there's an effective equation of state that describes the gas in the ISM, with the idea being that this effective equation of state assumes that there's a certain mixture of a cold phase and hot phase. And the effective equation of state is then exactly what you see here as the number density versus the temperature. So this thin line is all star-forming gas that sits in the ISM. Yeah, so this is not some artifact or so. This is really by construction, the model is constructed that way. And again, the idea was that you have low resolution in large volume simulations, so it doesn't make much sense to try to resolve the ISM properly if you have a very large volume and you don't have enough resolution elements in the ISM. Of course, nowadays this has changed a bit. So if you look, for example, at TNG50, so the mass resolution of TNG50, which is of course not 100 megaparsec or 200 megaparsec box, but still 50 megaparsec cube. But the mass resolution is kind of comparable to what you get in typical or average Zoom simulations. So at that point, it really makes sense to come up with a better ISM model that you could then also use for these large volume simulations. And so this is what SMUGGLE is. And on the right, you see the phase diagram of SMUGGLE, and it looks, very different. You get now all these distinct phases: a warm phase, a hot phase, a very cold phase, a coldish phase. And so the phase diagram is significantly more populated. And if you compare it to this typical effective ISM model on the left that we used for TNG. You can also quantify this in more detail if you look at mass and volume PDFs. So this is now split, the total distribution into cold, warm, and hot, and you can nicely see these coexisting phases, with a significant volume fraction of the hot phase, but then also significant contributions, especially in terms of the mass of a cold and a warm phase, all coexisting. And again, this is a plot you would not be able to make for TNG galaxies, because in TNG, this is all sub-resolution at the end of the day by construction. Now, you can check a couple of things of such a galaxy that is simulated with the SMUGGLE model. So on the left, I show here this is a plot from Federico's paper as well, but this is showing the outflow and the inflow rate. And you can see this is, it's fluctuating to some degree. Similarly, the wind mass loading, so the beta on the right, also shows these fluctuations. But if you look at the typical value, it kind of fluctuates around 1 or 2, which is kind of what we expect for a rough Milky Way-like galaxy. And the galaxy I show here is a Milky Way analog. So that kind of makes sense. And it also tells you that the regulation of the star formation works nicely, and also gives you more or less the right wind mass loading in terms of the outflows. Now the star formation rate is shown here. So this is a bit of a busy plot, but the orange line is kind of what we use in TNG. And so this again, this effective equation of state. So this goes back to this paper by Volker and Lars from 2003. It's a very quiescent star formation rate, and then these three colored lines, blue, red, and green, are different resolutions of the SMUGGLE model. Yeah. So, and they all differ by a factor of 10. Yeah. So the medium is a factor of 10 higher resolution than low, and high is a factor of 100 higher. And what you see here is you see this very bursty star formation rate, similar to what many of the other explicit models also predicted. But then if you look on the right at the integrated, or at the stellar mass as a function of time, so the integrated star formation rate, you see that after a giga-year, the masses of all these models are roughly the same. Yeah? So the smooth model, or this quiescent model, gives you more or less the same mass as these bursty models. But of course, the way how you get there is very different. So you get there either in a quiescent way or in this bursty way. A second thing that you can see in the plot on the right is that if you compare the blue, the red, and the green line for the SMUGGLE model, you see that they are more or less converged. So it's not full convergence, but it's the stellar mass doesn't differ too much after a giga-year between the three different resolutions, despite the fact they are different in mass resolution by a factor of 100. And so this is another feature that that Federico tried to incorporate in SMUGGLE, is to make it really kind of numerically stable in terms of resolution. Yeah. So the low resolution here is chosen such that it's more or less matched to the TNG50 resolution. And given that it's kind of converged based on this convergence test, the idea would be that you could use such a model, like the SMUGGLE model, also in a simulation like TNG50 by just removing the old ISM model and plugging in this new Smuggle ISM model. And then you would have a properly resolved ISM, and you would also get, for example, rid of things like these decoupled winds that we still use in TNG. So this is why, for example, Paul Torrey and others are working at the moment on some boxes with Smuggle, not 50 megaparsec, a bit smaller, but to actually try this out on a larger galaxy population. Good. So why am I talking so much about the Smuggle model? Well, the idea is that for THESAN, one of the next steps would be to also there replace the old ISM model, which is the TNG ISM model, with this Smuggle model. And that would have the advantage that we can say way more about the H2 regions, right? Because we have this properly resolved ISM, and then you can see the H2 regions more clearly and study them more clearly. And you also can potentially say a bit more about the detailed photon propagation through the ISM, and then also about things like escape fractions, which at the moment, because of the limitations in terms of the ISM model, are prescribed in THESAN. That could potentially be improved if we have higher resolution combined with this new ISM model. Just another thing, let me also show you here the stellar light. So this is the stellar light of the same galaxy that I showed the whole time. I didn't show TNG galaxies, but if any of you at some point has seen TNG galaxies, you will realize that for this Smuggle galaxy here, you see very fine-grained dust lanes, and you can also nicely identify star-forming regions. So this is all because of the more this explicit feedback, and also the multiphase structure that you can resolve in the ISM. So for example, the dust lanes are fine, are resolved to finite detail because you really have a true cold phase now in the gas with this reasonably small volume filling factor. So you get these very small regions, and this is where the dust is mostly growing, and then you get most of the dust absorption. Yeah? So this is why this looks rather different from dust processed or RT processed TNG galaxies, for example, simply because we have this multiphase structure. And the same is true for the more localized star-forming regions, which we would also not have in TNG. So then these regions are larger and more distributed. But here again, star formation is most significant in the cold regions where you have proper conditions for star formation. And so this also looks then in total rather different from a typical TNG galaxy. So I don't have a TNG galaxy in the talk now, but if you just look at the papers and look at the TNG galaxies, you will see that this looks quite different. Now, as I said, in THESAN, we would like to use this now also, this new ISM model. And for that, we would need to couple it to the dust and to the RT. And Raoul has already done this a couple of years ago. So this is already published in a paper that came out last year. And this is just one plot of this paper where Raoul used the same galaxy I showed you the whole time, but then did all the RT. So it's a full RHD simulation. And then you can make quite interesting predictions. For example, you can make detailed optical predictions, but also UV predictions. And because of the dust, you can also make IR emissions. So from first principle. And for the dust, you can then do even more. You can, for example, also make dust to gas predictions. So this is phase on and edge on. And because of the coupling of the RT, you can also make dust temperature predictions. And so this is a dust temperature map showing the dust range from a couple of Kelvin to 50 Kelvin. Now, these are all still isolated galaxies. So what we are currently working on, specifically Raoul and a couple of other collaborators, is to do this in a cosmological context for Zoom galaxies first, and then eventually do this for a small volume with this new ISM model, the RT coupling and the dust. And then, as I mentioned before, with the idea being to get more insights onto H2 regions and so on and so forth. Good. So instead of a conclusion, I just want to mention one more thing. which is that I mostly talked here about this paper of Raoul, which came out just a couple of months ago. To this introductory paper to the THESAN project. But then there were a couple of other papers that maybe might also be interesting to some of you. So Enrico wrote a paper on the properties of the IgM and Lyman alpha forest, and also the connection to reionization era galaxies, to look specifically at that connection. And then Aaron wrote a paper on Lyman alpha emission and transmission during the epoch of reionization. And then Raoul wrote another paper that just came out, I think, a month or two ago, on multi-tracer line intensity mapping. So where he looked at various emission lines and also cross-correlated those with 21 centimeter by using the simulation. Again, for these applications, the volume might still be too small. So this is why we will, in the near future, also run a larger volume. But nevertheless, I think there are some interesting results in this paper. And I think I will stop here at that point. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Great
Thanks.
talk. So we have a few minutes.
Yep.
So let me start with asking a question, and then let's maybe go around. So what kind of data are you essentially waiting for now in order to, so of course with the application of the, epoch of reionization. So what kind of data are you most excited that you're hoping to see in the next few years?
Yeah, I think there's now a lot of 21 centimeter data coming in. Like, for example, we have at MIT this HERA project. So we collaborating with, which is a 21 centimeter experiment. So we're collaborating with them to specifically test maybe some of these alternative dark matter models, about the bubble sizes. So that's something that I'm personally rather interested in. Then there's of course this whole, idea of mapping out detailed high redshift luminosity functions with JWST. So we had here in this paper, I showed them some UV luminosity functions and also galaxy stellar mass functions. So it would be nice to see what JWST really predicts. And we had before THESAN also a couple of studies where we looked at the impact also of alternative dark matter models on the high redshift luminosity functions. So there's a certain chance that JWST could potentially say something about that by really measuring that in detail. It's still for reasonably motivated dark matter models that are not yet ruled out by other observations, it might still be rather challenging to do this through luminosity functions. But I think that's something, that I'm personally quite interested in beyond the 21 centimeter stuff. So these are I guess Aaron would have another answer because he's very interested in Lyman alpha emission and emitters. But that's at least from my point of view quite interesting.
Okay, thank you. Any questions for Mark? Aurel, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. A very nice talk.
Thank you.
I have a question regarding the emissivity that you showed and this relation between galaxies and AGN.
Yeah.
So not sure I understood this correctly. So you're saying that for the reionization process, essentially for the radiative transfer UV photons, AGN play a subdominant role, right?
Yeah, that is what this plot shows. Yeah.
Exactly. So now, okay, so what about the heating of the gas? So to what extent is this AGN contribution important to do the heating process?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I don't have an exact answer for that. I should also, before I say anything more, I also have to say one more thing. So there's a caveat in this plot. So there are actually two caveats. One is that we have a rather small volume. We don't get these very massive systems and with strong AGN emission. And then, there's no nice way how I can say this now, but there's a tiny bug in the AGN emission calculation, which underestimates that a bit. So I would take that plot with a grain of salt. So whether it's really, I think it is subdominant in the range we show, but it might not be as subdominant as it looks like. So we have to double check again because there was a minor issue in the AGN photon emission calculation. but at least the results I showed, yeah. So in terms of the reionization process, the H1 fractions and so on. So those, I mean, these things just see these photons, right? So the but I don't have a plot that tells you exactly, okay, what is the impact of the stars on the temperature and what is the impact of the agents. And to be honest, I would also need to think about how to disentangle that exactly, right? Because it all goes into the heating of the gas, and so one probably would need to make some controlled experiment or so. So I don't have a good answer for that at the moment.
Yeah, so I'm asking because we're working on exactly this problem with more semi-numerical methods. But so the question is, because the heating is mainly X-ray photons, and
which we don't model, right? So that's
exactly. So you're saying, so how do you do that with the different
it's very simplistic. So we just take a fixed SED, yeah, and then we have 3 frequency bins, which are the for two helium and 1 hydrogen, and then we modulate the SED just with the accretion rate on the black hole, right? So it's a fixed SED, which is very simplistic, right? But that's the best we could do given the limited knowledge we have about the black holes. And then if the black hole accretes more, it will go up, otherwise it goes down. And then out of this SED, we take only 3 frequency bands, the 2 helium and the 1 hydrogen. So it's very simplistic, and I think especially for things you just mentioned for the X-ray, I think we can literally not say anything about that, except maybe for taking accretion rates and then trying to, in post-processing, model somehow the X-ray contribution and then try to say something. But then this would become very similar to what you probably do already in this semi-numerical, semi-empirical way, right? So, I mean, it doesn't come from first principle from the simulation. We just don't track the X-ray, essentially.
Yeah, well, it's a very, very difficult problem.
Yes,
I mean, it's already great.
No, it's very difficult. Yeah. I mean, but it's great that you work on that, but I think we can say very little with the simulation. Yeah.
Any more questions for Mark? Any questions from the ICS audience?
Can I ask another one then?
I guess. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just wondering about I mean, due to this very difficult situation that you want at the same time high resolution to get the small galaxies and large volume. I was just wondering, so you have a sort of a minimum halo mass that produces stars that is a few times 10 to the 8, right?
So we barely resolve atomic cooling halos with, I think, 50 dark matter particles or so. So that's the limit we have. I mean, depends what you consider resolve, but that's the lower limit, right? And then, of course, we have more resolution elements for larger systems, but that's kind of...
That's what I guess here comes the question, because so what means barely resolved exactly? So, I mean, you're nearly there, right?
But I think what I mean by barely resolved is that, okay, I get the dark matter mass right. I might get the overall gas mass roughly right. Then with star formation rates and so on, I'm not sure. Of course, internal structure, so we don't get it all right. So it's just at the limit. I think I would feel way more confident if I had twice or 4 times the resolution to say really something about these objects, right? And to be honest, that was also, there was some debate also with a referee on that point, because this is just the point. I mean, it's an important point to get these objects right, but then it's just at the limit of the simulation, because exactly of that compromise that you mentioned in terms of volume and the resolution at the same time. So this is also why we are currently running a couple of smaller volume simulations where this is way better resolved in, right? And so that's something we're looking into at the moment.
I'm looking forward to see these upcoming papers.
Thanks. Good.
Okay, so I think it's 10:55. Unless there's a final pressing question, I think let's thank Mark again for the great talk.
Yeah. Thanks again for the chance to talk to you. Thanks a lot.